years, and he likes to remember the dean of the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. He is the editor of the Review of Metaphysics. He has written a number of books. One of his recent books was devoted to Jacques Maritain, to whom this university has a special relationship. This morning, Jude is going to talk to us, Dr. Dougherty, Dean Dougherty is going to talk to us on the subject, preserving national identity in the global marketplace. It's a pleasure to present to you Dr. Jude Dougherty.
Well, thank you much. The present generation, for the first time in history, is experiencing a unity of mankind such that nothing can happen anywhere that does not concern all. The Stoic understanding of the unity of mankind, the framework of the polis, has been expanded to include the whole of mankind. The growing interdependence among nations seemingly has ended the days of absolute national sovereignty. Almost imperceptibly, a new attitude has developed regarding interdependence, so much so that a United States of Europe is regarded as an imminent possibility. As Europeans debate a potential constitution, the loss of national sovereignty looms with unacknowledged consequences. This eradication of national identity is occurring at the same time that there is a widespread awareness that the West has lost some of the spiritual resources which animated its past. To the extent that the proposed European Constitution allows Brussels to become the organizer-in-chief of European society, it will become the enemy of representative government, shifting power from the people to a bureaucratic imperium that tolerates little authority outside of itself. Failing to acknowledge the Hellenic and Christian sources of Western culture, the Constitution, by implication, mandates a cultural reform, a cosmopolitan, homogenized Western Europe severed from its traditions and controlled by a centralized secular bureaucracy. The proposed Constitution, in effect, casts aside any idea of a distinctive Western social, geographic, or cultural space that should be protected. George Santayana, writing in the early decades of the 20th century, saw it coming. In a memorable passage, he wrote, this is a quotation, "The present age is a critical one and interesting to live in. The civilization characteristic of Christendom has not disappeared, yet another civilization has begun to take its place. We still understand the value of religious faith, but on the other hand, the shell of Christendom is broken. The unconquerable mind of the East, the pagan past, and the industrial socialist future confront it with equal authority. On the whole, life and mind is saturated with the slow upward filtration of a new spirit, that of an emancipated, atheistic, international democracy," end quote. Of course, Santayana was not alone in this assessment. Long gone were the days when Hilaire Belloc could proclaim, "Europe is the faith is Europe." Philosophers and theologians as diverse as Nietzsche and Leo XIII addressed with alarm the intellectual climate shaping the 19th century. Old patterns of thinking were losing the allegiance of the European intelligentsia. Lost was the confidence that the inherited could withstand the secular assault mounted with the supposed support of new discoveries in the natural sciences. Leo XIII recommended Aquinas as the antidote to the nihilism and anti-Christian spirit that animated the intellectual climate of his day. Nietzsche and later Husserl and Heidegger, each in his own way, called for a revival of classical learning. Discussions in philosophical circles tended to focus on the meaning of the term Europe. In his 1935 lecture, Philosophy and the Crisis of European Humanity, Edwin Husserl offered an analysis of Europe's spiritual and intellectual crises that looked to ancient Greece as a way out of facing the crises that he found in the West. Husserl found in the Greek spirit of philosophical inquiry the sources of what he called free and theoretical universal reflection that would serve as a supranational ideal of reason. In Husserl's words, there are only two escapes from the crises of European existence: the downfall of Europe in its estrangement from its own rational sense of life, its fall into hostility toward the spiritual and into barbarity, or the rebirth of Europe from the spirit of philosophy through a heroism of reason that overcomes naturalism once and for all. The classical sources of Western culture no one can deny, but is that the whole story? The poet and philosopher Paul Valery would answer with a resounding no. In his day, Hilaire Belloc could say, speaking of Europe, spiritually, we are all Semites. That may have been true, but despite a certain spiritual and cultural affinity then as now, cultural differences within Europe exist, and defining national identity is become more difficult, a fact more apparent as Turkey is being considered for membership in the European Union. There is, in fact, and I'm sure all of us have experienced it, a national character that is German, an Italian character, a French character, and the world is richer for it. An outsider would not want these traits to disappear. It's more difficult to define an American character. Until recently, the American character was an amalgam of many strains found in Europe. Immigration policy and failure to integrate many immigrants into what is essentially a European culture has eroded that character. National identity is a challenge to be faced in both Europe and America. Absent a common bond in the people, absent a cultural identity, can the laws, let alone the customs and transactions that depend on virtue in the people, be maintained? England, as a result of its immigration and asylum policy, is losing its identity to the chagrin of native Englishmen. The newcomers, in bringing their own culture with them, eschew British traditions, creating enclaves of their own to the detriment of a larger society. Some say that the Englishman we know from history, literature, and film is becoming extinct, with the sovereignty of the country itself in jeopardy as the European Union further erodes Britain's self-governance. National identity, self-governance, that's too strong. Well, what then is a nation? It's not easy to define clearly what a nation is. A line traced on a map and on the ground, constituting a frontier, is the result of a series of incidents sanctioned by treaties. It may separate countries that are alike and join others that are very different. Then, too, there is a tendency to generalize characteristics that are far from indicative of the whole. Few have difficulty speaking of the Englishman, the German, the Italian, and even the Alsatian. But these broad, imprecise designations may serve a purpose in colloquial speech and may be indicative of certain prejudices, yet they do have a foundation in reality, indicative of national or cultural traits. It's manifestly easier to differentiate between Oriental traits and Occidental ones than between Polish and Czech. Color, custom, and culture differentiate, but then so do opinions, prejudices, and evaluations. To understand a nation, be it England, France, Germany, or Italy, we must attend to what each is created in the realm of mind. The total intellectual and artistic treasure, the accumulated beauty of great works of art written, sculpted, and painting, are constitutive of a culture that would not exist apart from its roots in a particular national setting. A Frenchman becomes a Frenchman not merely by reason of birth in a particular geographic territory, but by reason of a literary tradition to which he's introduced early on. One might say, just as one develops a Catholic mind by reading the Church Fathers, by reading Justin Martyr, Clement, and Augustine, the medieval doctors of the Church, and modern commentaries thereon. Paul Valéry, in speaking of France, will say, "The French nation resembles a tree several times grafted, the quality and flavor of whose fruit are the result of a happy wedding of very different saps and humors, combining in a single indivisible life. Whether we speak," he continues, "of the captains, Jeanne d'Arc, Louis IX, Henry IV, Richelieu, the Convention, or Napoleon, we are referring to one and the same thing, an active symbol of our national identity and unity." Well, does the preservation of national identity matter? It matters to a host of immigrants in both Europe and North America who seek to retain not only their inherited customs, but even their native language and legal traditions in their adopted country. And it matters because these traditions, the components of what we call a culture, are specific. One cannot be a citizen of the world. Identity is local. It is the characteristic of a people who have inhabited a land over a period of time, who have developed certain collective habits, evident in their manners, their dress, the feasts that they collectively enjoy, their religious bonds, the premium they put on education, and their attention to precision and detail. These are not universal traits, but are rooted in centuries past and depend on an historical consciousness and attention to deeds of ancestors past. National identity is threatened from two sources: the immigrant who refuses to assimilate, and the secular, anti-Christian, international socialists represented by the ruling elites of Brussels and the capitals of Europe. That mentality is ascendant within the Western media, the entertainment industries, and is overrepresented in our politicized American universities. European identity is further challenged by a population decline in former Christian lands and by a resurgent Islam, confident that it will one day rule the continent. Political theorists envisage that by the end of the century, France will have become the Islamic Republic of France. Some think that the Arabia feared by Bataillon is inevitable. Charles Murray, in promoting his recent book, declares Europe's run is over. Need it be so? Paul Valery, in talking about national identity, also gave us a very broad definition of Europe. Europe is more than a geographical designation, he insists. Wherever the names of Caesar, Caius, Trajan, and Virgil, of Moses and St. Paul and Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid have simultaneous meaning, there is Europe. And again, every trace and land that has been successfully Romanized, Christianized as regards the mind, disciplined by the Greeks, is absolutely European. Shakespeare, he points out, is an integral part of French, Italian, and German culture. So too Goethe and Dante. Valery goes on to say, Christianity introduced a universal moral law that took its place alongside the juridical unity contributed by Roman law. Christianity, in taking all that it could from Rome, gave us a common law, a common God, the same temporal judge, and one and the same judge in eternity. But having acknowledged the influence of Christianity, Valery turns to the role of classical learning. He speaks of, quoting it now again, subtle yet powerful influence to which we owe the best of our intelligence, the acuteness and solidity of our knowledge, so also the clarity, purity, and elegance of our arts and literature. It is from Greece these virtues come. What we owe Greece, he maintains, is perhaps the most profoundly, what we owe Greece is what has most profoundly distinguished us from the rest of humanity. I ran across a summer travel brochure that delighted me when I read it. It tells us that the Greek island Santorini was shaped by its natural cataclysms, but its villages and landscape seemed chiseled by the island's stark light. Out of that light came not only the great statues of ancient Greece and the long, clean lines of the Parthenon, but the precise vocabulary for ideas that gave birth to Western philosophy. Well, you might have missed a middle term there, connecting land, sky, and philosophy, but you have to admit the image is delightful. Continuing with a remark of Valery, Europe is above all the creator of science. While there have been arts in all countries, there has been true science only in Europe. Well, you can be sure that if Valery had been part of the commission drafting the European Constitution, he would have insisted that it contained reference to both the Hellenic and Christian character of Europe. And Husserl and Heidegger would agree. And we may add, the Greeks understood well the interdependence of Polis and Okios, of public and private, in praising the polis as the highest level of human achievement, Aristotle did not ignore the private realm, nor did he undervalue the ties of family for the sake of an abstract polity. Rather, he recognized that the city survives only as long as the private, particular world of the family survives. And for Aristotle, that included piety of a religious sort, as well as piety toward one's ancestors and one's state. Pope Benedict, in that famous Regensburg address, said as much. The best of Greek thought is an integral part of Christian faith, but with the vision of his mentor, Augustine, Benedict sees more than either Husserl or Heidegger, affirming that reason cannot allow itself to remain deaf to the divine.
Our custom is, if you want to pose a question to Professor Dougherty, there are microphones scattered around the room. And if you would come up and introduce yourself and then address your question to Professor Dougherty.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Belfort-Chalot. I was fascinated by your description of the current status, and much taken by a phrase you used of the law being based, or the required basis for law is virtue in the people. As educators, as most of us are, what would you suggest that we do in our institutions to foster and enhance the formation of virtuous people?
Well, I think the answer is rather simple. You give them a lot of Aristotle and a lot of the Stoics and let them on their own. If they're from a Christian background, they will integrate that, and that will become Christian teaching. Most of the moral teaching that we associate with the Catholic Church is, in fact, Stoic. Tris.
I'm seating for you.
Okay.
Paul Griffiths, University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm interested in your positive evaluation of the nation state and the importance of its maintenance. It's not a judgment I share at all, and as you know, there are different narratives to tell about what the nation state is and about what its significance is. A couple of examples. You said that England, in the perspective of many native-born Englishmen, has lost its English character to their chagrin. Well, I'm a native-born Englishman, and not to mine. The England I grew up in the 60s and 70s was an irredeemably and profoundly pagan culture. The England of today is more complex and more interesting, not least because there are now many more serious believers in God living in it than there used to be. Most of them are Muslims. I welcome this. The reason for that example is that the narrative of the nation state that I would prefer is one that sees it as intrinsically aimed toward paganism. By that I mean that the nation state, as we understand it, didn't come into being until after the Peace of Westphalia, roughly speaking. And since then, it has been blood-soaked beyond all possible imagination. Vast piles of corpses are present at its hands, and it has, for the most part, been inimical to the practice of Christianity, and especially to the Catholic Church. If you think about the history of France as an example, you'll see what I mean. My own view then would be that rather than think romantically and nostalgically about the delights of a unified culture in a nation state, we, Catholics, should be eagerly fostering and developing transnational institutions. I think the Pope would agree.
Well, you make a number of very good points there. Your pagan England of the 60s That's manifest. I mean, it's there for all of us to see. I would go one further and say that it's worse than pagan. The pagans did not reject Christ because they did not know Christ. But the Enlightenment mentality that has permeated Western culture deliberately rejects Christ. I would say that's worse than merely being pagan. The other points that you were making about absorption of foreign cultures, so to speak, within one geographic entity that we describe as a nation. Lord Patrick Devlin, writing in the 60s, was saying something like, and I wish I could paraphrase him precisely, that if we lose a common bond out of which our laws have been created, the laws themselves will crumble. And the nation he didn't have much hope for. Now, this is Lord Patrick Devlin, the prominent British jurist, writing in the period that you just referred to. That remark, I think, has to be taken seriously. Now, if you've got what is essentially Europeans coming into England, I mean, the Polish bring with them their traditions, and they create enclaves in London and elsewhere. But the Muslims coming in, they are not within a natural law tradition. The Sharia is positive law. And how you bring the two together, now, I won't live long enough to see what happens in England, but I think it's impossible to square contradictories. You made other remarks that I would like to get into, but we'll give Tris Engelhardt. Dr. Engelhardt.
I'm a person who has great sympathy for nationalism. After all, I'm a Texan and suffer under the yoke of the Yankee. But let me talk about how cultures get suppressed. Because up till recently, anyone in England knew he was not part of Europe. I mean, the quip, fog on the channel, Europe isolated. The English understood their whole way of recognizing what it was to live a well-ordered life was in contradiction to what framed Europe. Now, I think that's something very important to think about. I mean, contemporary Europe is bound up to that great happening on the 2nd of December, 1804, when Napoleon promulgates his code and finally realizes Justinian's notion that you would bring human rights and social justice to everyone. Thank God, if you're a member of a common law country, no place in our common law does it mention human rights, social justice. Our Constitution, nowhere in its body speaks about fairness, equality. It is a common law framework of how people understand the rootedness in history. And so the interesting thing might be the importance of being able to maintain a sense of locality, which Anglo-American law may do much better and protect because it's free of any natural law commitments, has nothing to do with Justinian's Justitias Constans et Perpetua Voluntas Jus Sui Quidque Tribuens. We do what we've always done in the courts. And if one looks how both officers of courts and sheriffs and all of common law frames itself without any classical roots, one might see where there is a protection for Christianity flourish, and interestingly, not coming from either Athens or from Paris. Next time you go between Macau and Hong Kong, you'll notice that the people in Hong Kong think totally differently because they have common law. There's a wonderful movie from France in the 1960s called Black and White in Color, which shows the war between German Togoland, French Togoland, and the Gurkhas coming in who had internalized common law. How we look at law defines us. And perhaps what defines, and it defined England up to recently, was its blessed freedom from natural law, human rights, social justice, and its embeddedness in history through the good pagan Anglo-Saxon law.
I take it that requires no comment.
Hi, you made a statement concerning Western media and academia, and I have one very specific question, but I want to preface it with one, I think, fairly radical statement. And the statement is this: I believe that by the end of the 21st century, Osama bin Laden will be known as the greatest proto-evangelist for the Christian faith of world history. I base that on the fact of having worked as a missionary to Muslims for 30 years and seeing a change in terms of Muslims in large numbers across the globe becoming Christians. So much so that even an avowed atheist, Ibn Waraq, has documented some of those movements in his book, Leaving Islam, from Prometheus Press. Given these aspects, my question to you is, what is the attitude of Western academia to the task that Christians have to share the good news of Jesus Christ with Muslims in a context of freedom of religion?
Well, I find the academic world anti-Christian from one end of the country to the other. And the same is pretty much true on the continent. So Christianity needs, above all, institutions of higher learning, where the rather sophisticated arguments advanced by philosophers and others against the faith can be defended by equally well-trained, shall we say, persons equipped with a Christian background. I don't think the playing field is level. It's very difficult, for example, for a Catholic philosopher to be appointed in a state or a private university. I did a little calculation once, and my memory, I'm an old guy, so my memory may not be precise, but I think the number was something like 365 full professorships within the Ivy League and the Big Ten. That's the only groups that I looked at. Out of 365 professorships, guess how many were awarded to, or how many Catholics occupied?
I would guess 10.
No. 2, and we're in doubt about 1. Less than 1%. Now, that's my claim that there is a kind of bias against anybody who wants to represent Christianity seriously at an academic level in our American universities, state and secular, private.
To add to that, in a survey that was done of the anthropologists of America, and I'm not arguing for either Republican or Democrat, but there are 32 Democrats for every one Republican among anthropologists in America.
Well, I'm not going to try to make anything of that, but in my house, we all vote like Mother tells us. Please.
Dr. Edward Pellegrino, who has lectured in this hall on numerous occasions, in March of 2004 had an editorial in JAMA on medical ethics born by tyranny and war, describing how Iraqi physicians did terrible things to people under the regime of Saddam Hussein. 1 or 2 weeks after this editorial came out, the American press was filled with pictures of Abu Ghraib and what we did in Iraq. And Dr. Pellegrino's answer to all the excesses of physicians under Saddam Hussein was, you need to be taught moral probity. Since events since he published his paper show that this is not just Iraqi physicians, but Americans. As a Catholic institution, what can be done to teach moral probity?
Aristotle and the Stoics mainly. But let me tell you a story about Pellegrino. He is a close personal friend. I see him frequently. He has represented the United States on an international committee designed to draw up a ethical policy for biomedical research. The ground rules, no confessional principles are to be allowed. This is going to be a secular document. This is a group, 15, 16 nations, and he ended up on the drafting committee. I may add that he's chairman of the President's Council on Biomedical Ethics. The chairman of that group was an Australian judge. And they are discussing the grounds of morality. And Pellegrino mentions in discussions of justice the 4 cardinal virtues. And the judge objected. We don't want that Catholic stuff. Pellegrino had to explain that the 4 cardinal virtues are discussed by Plato. Well, later on in the conversation, Pellegrino again makes a faux pas. He quotes Aristotle, and the judge, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Australia, said, we don't want any of that Catholic stuff. Now, I mean, the problem is, you know, if you have supposedly educated people who haven't read any of the classics, I mean, this is what Husserl and Heidegger, among others, were fighting. We've got to get back to the study of the classics to find our identity. And in this case, we're talking about moral identity. So if you're a member of that committee, I mean, would you have any optimism that you were going to come up with anything meaningful?
You can try.
I'm Rose Tondra, and we live in Ames, Iowa, a university town. And I would like to ask you to relate the idea of ESSA to nation states regarding the formation of worldview. And the background of this question is our evangelical brothers and sisters are very productive regarding our own country in the shaping of a worldview that forms our identity. They go back to the original documents, to letters written between statesmen, to state constitutions, and from that they are creating an identity that they wish us to hold to. And this seems to me to be what they're working towards is our ESSA. And it seems to me that this would be a way to respect other nation states too. It would be a filtering mechanism where we could recognize the good and perhaps judge the bad.
Thank you for that. I can only respond indirectly. In rearing my own sons, what I advise them if they get into a difficult situation, just to say I wasn't brought up that way. most of what we are is dependent upon our family inheritance, which takes place in a culture. When I and my family were once in Belgium, one of my kids, who couldn't have been more than 13 years old, he said, "I like being in a Catholic country." He had a feeling that the culture there was a bit different. I mean, that culture's long gone now. We're talking about 30 years ago. But the point I'm making about national identity is not so much a discourse about the nation state when it came into being, and positive and negative, but it's within a people that you develop your outlook on life, what you regard as important, whether you are brought up to get all the education you can, whether you're brought up to respect the laws of your nation, whether there's a penalty attached to violation or not. The morality we live by is much an inherited morality that comes unquestioned. St. Thomas would give custom the force of law in most instances. And I think that's what our colleague from England missed when he was growing up. The tradition simply lived no longer. And why? I don't want to blame it on British empiricism and all that, and its pernicious influence on Kant and other continental types, but we are what that tradition has provided us with. I mean, we try to understand it, we reject part of it, we assimilate ideas from without. I mean, it behooves us to read Confucius, to become acquainted with Buddhism, to become acquainted with Islam. I think that's a mandate today. But we still maintain identity not on a global scheme. We are citizens of a particular land with a particular inheritance. I think that's a main point. I may have been using Valerie to emphasize that, but he writes so much better than I do. Chris?
Christopher Lutz from St. Meinrad School of Theology. Dean Dougherty, I want to ask a follow-up question to your answer to Paul Griffiths. And Dr. Griffiths said that the England he grew up in was a profoundly pagan place. You said that that it seems worse than pagan because they had rejected Christ. And so my question is about, I mean, it's sort of peripheral, and it has to do ultimately with evangelization and where we move forward. But is it, should we read what appears to be a rejection of Christ as a real rejection of Christ? Or is it perhaps more appropriately to be considered a rejection of that bundle of cultural things that were presented as Christian in education? There's a prominent philosopher here this weekend who in the 1950s was a fideist philosopher of religion, and who in the 1960s was an atheist, but today is a prominent Christian. And I've puzzled over that turn to atheism in his work, and I'm perhaps I don't know him well enough, but it seems to me that very likely it was more of a rejection of a bundle of things than it was a rejection of Christ. But your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I must confess that I shop around for an appropriate parish on Sunday on the assumption that going to Mass should not be an occasion of sin, because what goes on there makes you so mad. I am sure that if I were exposed to good bit of Christianity, I would reject it. Now, that imposes on us. Tom Buford, who is here, long-time colleague, said, "You're going to talk about John Dewey?" Oh, I'll oblige you, Tom. Dewey, in his first lecture at the University of Michigan after getting his PhD at Hopkins, spoke on our obligation to know God. Dewey eventually ended up as an atheist, but in the beginning, he felt that strongly. And I think it is an obligation. Now, where do we go to fulfill that obligation? And that gets us back to, are there any universities where we can sit under, people of the like of Garrigou-Lagrange, have moral tutors such as John Henry Newman? Where do we find eminent, Christian philosophers, for example, in major universities? Can you name any? So I am reaffirming your point, I think. The obligation is there, but where are we going to fulfill that obligation? Where would you send your kids to study? Let's say philosophy and theology today. Needn't go far maybe, but Tris?
Jude, I think you've raised a whole bunch of very important issues. How do we understand our culture now in 2006? You and I'm an old man too. I mean, the first time I went to Europe in 1954, it was vibrantly Christian, at least the Roman Catholic elements of it. Walking through Italy, it was full of young priests, full of young monks. Same thing in Germany, in the village where my family came from. I'm a Central Texas Kraut, so I still speak German. The masses were full. I've watched the churches of Europe empty. And the question, is it an intellectual crisis at all? Is it even a moral crisis? Maybe it's a spiritual crisis. I mean, if people don't engage in rightly directed fasting, vigils, prayer, their religion dies out. At Rice University, the Orthodox Jews have no trouble maintaining their faith. The evangelical Christians have no trouble maintaining their faith. That's not because we have a whole bunch of Christian professors. That is, their very communities live. The question is, why the mainline churches die out all over Europe, and why they die out almost everywhere in the world. I think that's not an intellectual question. That's more a question that looks to issues of spirituality and not morality. It goes back to national, the sense of a people or a national identity. The Europeans hate us because we have so many fundamentalists and they're people who will actually have prayer breakfasts. It doesn't come from the mainline churches, it comes from the fundamentalists. So the very character of America is like de Tocqueville understood, coming out of all these free churches who actually believe and actually live. So I think the interesting issue might be to ask, is it an intellectual crisis at all? Is it a moral crisis at all? Maybe it's a spiritual crisis. And one might look at how the mainline churches died in our lifetime.
I would make a distinction between intellectual, moral, and spiritual. But quite a... Yeah, I know you did, but I can't disagree with you otherwise. Young lady?
You had a very intriguing presentation, but I was just wondering, in light of Chestertonian thought and also the Catholic thought of, and I can't remember the exact term for this, but it's kind of like, I'm just going to call it localism because that's what it seems like to me, but where you try to solve problems on a local level first, like first you go to the family, then to the community, and then to the state, and then to the nation. In light of that, how do you reconcile that belief with this globalism that we see present today, especially in like the European Union, and how people are trying to solve problems on an international level before the local level?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand what you're getting at. There is a kind of universalism that, in my own mind, growing up as a kid with some Catholic education, I identify with the Church Universal. As a matter of fact, a Protestant colleague of mine and I have traveled in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia. He said, Dougherty, what I envy you is you're at home everywhere in the world we go. Well, I was dragging him into churches I wanted to see, and he went along willingly. So, but there is a kind of identity that one acquires by being within an intellectual heritage. There is an identity you get because you love Aristotle, or you love the Stoics, or you love Aquinas, and you can meet and talk with people of that like mind anywhere you go. And I think that's a blessing. But Dr. Engelhardt was referring to the customs that reinforce a kind of perception that is there, and the manifestations of the faith are found in votive lights, processions, Feast of the Precious Blood, Corpus Christi. These are part of you, and if your childhood has been a happy one in that type of environment, it stays with you all your life, just as the catechism you may have remembered. You live off of that even when you're aged.
Thank you, Dean Dougherty, for your questions. I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan from Montreal. I have a question about, I guess, a tension between, I guess, sort of certain kind of universalism that when you talk about globalization, there's the idea of convergence and the world sort of adopting a kind of homogenization, and then the need to preserve national distinctiveness or something. But there is also something universal about Christianity and sort of it's Christianity in India, Christianity in Africa, etc. And both in globalization and in Christianity, whether you're looking at multinationals like IBM or religious order like the Salesians, across countries you see significant differences. Salesians in India don't operate exactly the same way as they do in America. They don't. The way orders are issued, the way Salesians in France evaluate their subordinates, for example, is different. And in the same way in IBM, the ways in which the structures are set up, just they aren't the same because of the national culture, the national modes of coordination that, despite changes and hybridizations, these characters still endure. My question is about how does so suppose I'm an Indian, and how do I, as an Indian Christian, when you say, well, you should look back to Aristotle is not part of my history as an Indian, but I recognize something in Aristotle that is stronger than any Indian philosopher. So what do I do sort of when I enter into dialogue with other Indians who say, well, you're a Westerner, or my parents were Hindus, for example, don't agree with sort of my philosophical statements because they contradict whatever reincarnation, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you preserve national identity in that sense?
That's a tough one. I think by virtue of your learning, you, as it were, step away from our family and even your cultural and national background so that you can communicate with people in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere because of a common vocabulary that somehow or another you've acquired and with which you can discuss some of the basic issues we've been discussing here. And I think that's to the good. But you don't want to leave behind your family and their ways. And even if they are strange to your newfound outlook or insight, you raised or made implicitly an important distinction between a kind of globalization that is inevitable, that is a result of markets and trade, result of natural resources being purchased, demand. Trade brings about that. That's inevitable. But I think what I've been arguing about, because my focus has been mainly Europe, is a kind of globalism that we should abandon our identities and become part of a cosmopolitan international community, so to speak. I mean, community is nonsense, but outlook that doesn't bind us to anything. So nothing is sacred, nothing is to be preserved. I think we got a lot to be thankful for and a lot to preserve. But we won't become preservationists if we give up and say, well, you know, it doesn't matter.
Don Schmeltekar from Baylor, a very different question. We haven't talked about globalization from the perspective of business.
Mm-hmm.
I would like for you to reflect a minute on the impact of major corporations, most of which are located in the United States or are headquartered here, and the globalization that's taking place with all those corporations, and the significance of that with regard to national identity.
Well, I can do that maybe with an anecdote. A friend of mine is a CEO of a major manufacturing company. He has opened 7 plants in China. And I was putting to him the question of whether, in effect, he's betraying his own country and its workforce by taking things overseas. And then about the possible effects that the culture of this cooperation would have on the localities in which he operates these plants. Well, he assured me, and he's talking about China, that going into China, it's not that you're going to affect anything there. They're going to affect you in the way you do business. And the first question is, what are you going to do for the community here? And after you've settled all your local debts, there may be some profit. Well, why don't you make that stuff in the States and ship it abroad? Well, for one thing, the Chinese hand is not the American hand, so tools have to be created that will fit the locale. And if you're not present locally with something that is geared to the local, you're not present at all. So I got an entirely different, now this is a Catholic gentleman. He has a Catholic conscience, but he has plans in Germany too. But he was convinced that in taking advantage of a local market, he wasn't taking anything away from Illinois or Indiana. And I believe him in his case. I'm not sure that's true with everything. Now that's globalization, but globalism is a kind of ideology that, you know, we should all be blended into a common secular international culture. I'm arguing against multiculturalism mainly, and its effects on the individual, the society, and the laws.
I'm encouraged by Tristram Engelhardt to ask a second question since he's already done that. I hear in what you've said, maybe I'm mishearing, but I do hear it, an excessively positive evaluation of national identity. That's my fundamental worry. It was the worry behind my first question as well. I heard it also in the question from a question earlier about the essence of nations. Nations are not the kind of entities that can have essences, it would seem to me. So let me sketch briefly an alternative view that ought to be persuasive to Catholics, I think. It is that we Catholics are members of only 2 real communities. One is the community of the family, which is a community of blood, or we might now say genes. The other is the community of the church, which is a community of sacramental gift. All the other communities to which we belong are imagination all the way down. They can be reimagined, unimagined, imagined away. The nation, then, is one of those. The question for us is, what degree of imaginative effort do we want to put into it, the nation, that is to say? My suggestion to you would be that American Catholics and American Christians in general put vastly too much effort into imagining America. It would be better if we stopped. The same would be true, though with different modalities, for some kinds of English people. And I won't speak to other nationalities here. So I'd like your reaction to that.
Well, I want to ask you a question. Now, I take it you're a Brit. Do you still identify as a Brit?
I'm a naturalized American.
What does that mean? What have you become?
I became a citizen of the United States of America.
Does that mean anything other than, you know, a passport?
It's an act of the imagination on my part. But imagination has significance, of course. I don't mean it doesn't have any. It means that it's an act that I willingly undertook.
Would you find a better word than imagination?
No, it's the best one.
I think imagination tends to make it fiction.
Yes, that's the whole point.
And I don't think being a citizen of the U.S. is a fiction.
Well, look, it is in the following sense, that if we stop imagining it, it will go away. Real communities don't go away if you stop imagining them. The family, for example, if I cease imagining my parents as my parents, they'll still be my parents. If I cease imagining the church as the church, it will still be the church. If we all cease imagining nation states and trade unions and whatever else you care to name, they go away. And history shows this.
But that imagination is concretized in feasts that we celebrate, pageants.
Sure.
How we venerate, let's say, our parents, how we venerate the church itself, the patriotic feasts that we observe. Now, in a way, that's all imagination, too. It's a product of, it's a concrete instantiation of what you're calling imagination. I don't think that's bad.
I didn't say it was bad. I said, though, that I'm making a claim in the order of being, right? In the order of being, there are two real communities, the family and the church. Other communities do not have ontological reality. They have imaginative reality. So my question is, then we can think about how much imagination to devote to them. Sometimes we should devote a lot, sometimes not much. My diagnostic position would be that at the moment in the US, devoting imagination to being American is almost entirely negative.
I would like to see the paper you're going to write about that.
I think a very interesting question has been raised, namely, what are the moral implications of thinking about oneself as a member of a nation state? And one might, I've thought about that in how to educate my children and my grandchildren. I try to educate them to be Texans, not Americans. I have no fear of globalization. My boots here are made in Hong Kong. My nice Western coat is also. But it's a way of skilling my grandchildren to think of them as a particular people over in a secular world. Surely the only thing that I agree with you completely, only the church lives and our family, and we hold that water is thicker than blood. And that is what happens when we enter into the church. We enter into something much more important as a community. But what one learns in being a Texan is to learn how to transcend history, to think of oneself as in a now. I mean, my family, Texas has been under different countries. We've been part of Mexico, Confederacy, now we're in the Americans. Who know what will be in the future? But if we can think of ourselves as that community, maybe that can skill my children in what it is to think of themselves as Orthodox Christians. I mean, when I go to Orthodox churches, I go into, my wife and I, for reasons I have no idea, we're invited to give lots of retreats for Orthodox Indians in the United States. We once were home, they're Orthodox. I go all over the world, and in totally different languages and Eastern and Western rites of the Orthodox Church, my kids are able to enter into a now. And that's not an intellectual issue. It's not just that we see ourselves unbroken over time, but all communities that do endure teach that one is bound over geography and over time. And the imagination sometimes developed about what it is to be a Texan under the Mexican oppressor than the American oppressor. It gets a skill capacity to maintain one's identity, and that may be a virtue even for those poor people who are not blessed with being Texan.
You have reinforced nearly everything I said.
I'm your amen, Charlie. I'm here to say amen.
Professor Dougherty, my name is Pedro Hernandez, a professor of sociology and philosophy at State University of Puebla. In your provocative reflections, which I really grateful for, I confess that I missed something which seems to me important. Maybe I'm wrong. But again, this is my view of something which is also a profound mark of modernity, which is the thing that I was missing, and I think that complements your views, if I'm correct. In my reading of the history of civilizations and ideas, I found that repeatedly it's a pillar, like a big pillar, of a triad of religion, family, and politics, sustaining really the cultural endeavors of men. And what characterizes modernization and modern times and globalization in these times is the usurpation of, as a civilizatorian axis of economics, trying to put itself in the place of this triad, which has traditionally supported civilizations. And that I may be repeating the views of a positivist philosopher that I really feel a lot of appreciation for, although I don't exactly agree with him now, Durkheim. It's the preface to the second edition of his work on labor. He said what you perhaps remember, no? The day economics takes the place of the civilizational axis of mankind, all we can expect from that is the imperium of force and tragedies. And I used to remember, let us make a brief account, between 2000 and 2004, 17 armed conflicts in the world. So, and that's a mark of our civilization. So, provoking you again in your reflections to continue just briefly that beyond just going back, which I agree with you very much, I couldn't more, going back to Aristotle and the Stoics, how really are we working to really overcome this tremendous mark of economics in our lives, compartmentalize, as Professor McIntyre was telling us yesterday night, and really overcome it by fraternity, because it seems to me that without sharing, the whole view of the development of this world and our peaceful life in this world is really a mockery if we don't go to sharing. Because in a world of minimal and reduced resources and finite resources, there's no way of gain as many of the liberal economists want. It's a zero-sum game. Somebody will lose at the end, as perhaps Jared Diamond has shown us in his last book. And so I just want to hear your comments. Maybe I am wrong in that mark of what the economist, or how the economics has done really to our civilization now, if I'm wrong or right.
Well, in economics, I'm a disciple of Hayek, I think. I'm surprised that you were quoting Durkheim, because I rarely have a good word to say about Durkheim. He was very much opposed to any institution that would stand between the individual and the state. He thought that the abolition of all would the individual achieve freedom? If there are no family structure, no religious structure, no community structure between you and being a citizen of a particular state, then you were absolutely free. I mean, it's just the reverse of the picture that I am trying to present in this modest paper.
I was referring to the fact that today everything is valued only in economic terms, even science. And that is what he was referring to in the prologue to his book. Civilization usurpating what the best triad of family, religion, and politics were in civilizations prior to ours. That's what was referring.
Yes. Well, I don't like Durkheim. Sister?
Hi, I'm Sister Thomas Moore from Aquinas College in Nashville, Tennessee. This is more of a comment of some of the discussion here. I don't have the citation, but John Henry Newman wrote that the modern crisis is not a crisis of unbelief, but it's a crisis of the imagination. And I think some of the discussion here is worth continuing.
The two may go together, I'm sure.
I'm Father Connor from Opus Dei in New York City. I was just wondering if Paul Griffiths, I mean, how would he consider John Paul II's testimony ontologically of his experience as a Pole? As a matter of fact, his June 2nd homily in Warsaw that galvanized solidarity and galvanized Poland. Is that, I mean, was that imagination or, yes, he says yes. Well, anyway, it seems to me no. Well, I think he raised up an identity of relation, of faith experience that is at the center. He talks about culture driving, really, is the root of the country. He says the country didn't have a government, didn't have any geographical boundaries for centuries and centuries, and still survived as a subject. He talks about subjectivity at the United Nations, remember? And he gave a huge presentation on the ontological reality of Poland without all of the externals of government or boundaries or anything else. So I just want to counter that. I just present it to you because it's shocking to hear you say that.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it has a wait, just a minute, if I have the microphone. I don't need essences. It's just like Christianity doesn't have an essence. It has a person.
It's a gift of God.
No, Christianity is not a gift. Christianity is Jesus Christ. It's a person.
It's not Jesus Christ exhaustively, is it? It's the response of people to Jesus Christ.
Well, there's no response unless there's a...
In the order of being, Jesus Christ is real, the church is real, families are real, Polishness, Germanness, Englishness, Americanness ain't real. That's fundamental ontology.
Sorry. I feel it different.
I think...
Philosophy.
No, feeling is part of me.
Okay. We can entertain only one more question.
Thank you. And this is just a follow-up then. I think that it struck me that perhaps what you're saying is that our decision whether to exercise our imagination in order to continue a form of community, whether it's a country, a nation, a state, is a prudential question. When we think that that imagined community continues to support what is best and what is just. And I just wanted to make the comment that I think it also applies to those imagined communities which are universities, and that there's a moment, I think, in the life of different universities where we have to decide whether we think that that particular imagined community still deserves our loyalty and our pietas. And so that also is a prudential question for us.
Okay. I want to thank on your behalf Professor Dougherty for his presentation and all of you for your